G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Jeremiah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So thanks for coming along to this session 23. Today we're looking at Jeremiah 33:10 down to Jeremiah 34:22. What do we learn today? Well, we're still in the section where we have the restoration of Judah and Jerusalem. So it's a good news section. All about the restoration of Jerusalem and Judah. In verses 10 to 11 of chapter 33, we're looking at the return of peace and joy to Jerusalem. Now, at this time, Jeremiah is writing this. At this time, the siege of Jerusalem is still in progress. The fall of Jerusalem was so sure that God pictured it as if it had already happened. And again, what we see here is that there's a contrast between the past and the future. Verse 10 deals with the past, and the past was a past of judgment. The land became waste. It was without man and beast. The cities of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem became desolate. Now, this is looking at Jerusalem as if it has all taken place. The siege is finished. Jerusalem is destroyed. Okay, so looking at this, it speaks about Jerusalem as marked by desolation. But what we're going to see is that what was true of the past of Jerusalem will not be true of the future. Because in verse 11, there's going to come a time of great blessing. Once again, there's going to be herds in the cities and in the streets of Jerusalem. The voice of joy and gladness from the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride will once again be heard. They'll say, "Give thanks to Jehovah of hosts, for Jehovah is good, for his loving kindness endures forever, and of them that bring sacrifices of thanksgiving into the house of Jehovah." So the voices of those who will bring the sacrifice of praise into the house of the Lord will again be heard in the land. Now, this is looking into the restoration period. Now, 6 different voices are heard here. What we have, first of all, the voice of joy. We have the voice of gladness. We have the voice of the groom, the voice of the bride, the voice of them that say, "Give thanks," the voice of those who bring the sacrifices. So what we're seeing here is that there is now the removal of the previous judgment. It's a time of great rejoicing in this future time. Now, 3 different times earlier on, Jeremiah said that these things would disappear from the cities of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem. And he said them back in chapter 7, verse 4, 7, verse 34, 16, verse 9, and 25, verse 10. But now the very things he said would disappear will now reappear in the future. It's going to be a time of great blessing. And to this day, this verse is read during Jewish wedding ceremony as part of they call the Shavat Brakot, the 7 blessings that are said at the wedding and for the week following. This is part of the wedding ceremony for all the Jewish weddings. And they read this verse. Now, the reason for including this verse is that its emphasis is on the voices of the bridegroom and the bride. Now, the reason that all these things will return, the reason that there'll be a reversal of the previous judgments is because God says, "For I will cause the captivity of the land to return as at the first," says Jehovah. So Jehovah would restore the fortunes of the land as they were in the beginning. Now, in the previous passage, Jehovah mentioned that neither man nor beast would live in Jerusalem after the Babylonian invasion. And then now in verses 12 to 13, he promised that a time would come when this would all change. In verses 12 to 13, the flocks are going to flourish now. So thus says Jehovah of hosts, "Yet again there shall be in this place which is waste, without man, without beast, and in all the cities thereof, a habitation of shepherds causing their flocks to lie down." Now, verse 12 says here that again, there'll be a habitation throughout the land. It will become a habitation for shepherds that cause their flocks to lie down. The land was desolated. The land that was desolated will once again be inhabited by both man and beasts. And verse 13 says, "In the cities of the hill country," this is just a geography of where it's all going to take place. "Cities of the hill country, in the cities of the lowland, and in the cities of the south, and in the land of Benjamin, And in the places about Jerusalem, and the cities of Judah, shall the flocks again pass under the hands of him that numbers them, says Jehovah. So verse 13 deals with the geography. It emphasizes segments of geography to show what will be true for the entire land. It's going to include the cities of the hill country, the cities of the Shephelah, or the lowlands. It will include the Negev, or the south. It will include the land of Benjamin, which is the places around Jerusalem, and the cities of Judah. Remember, this Babylonian siege is around Jerusalem. It's the southern. Nebuchadnezzar has now come against the southern kingdom, Judah. So this is what we're talking about here. Now, the promise in the second part of verse 13 is that once again, the flocks will pass under the hands of the one who numbers them. Now, the shepherd is the one who numbers the sheep to make certain that they all have returned safely. And so it's going to be back to good times. They'll lie down in safety. It'll be just a time of safety and blessing for them. Now, in verses 14 to 16, we see the reconfirmation of the Davidic covenant and the Levitical priesthood. Now, verses 14 to 26 show that this reconfirmation of the Davidic covenant and the priesthood will come in relation to Jerusalem in verses 14 to 18. 14 to 18, we're going to see Jerusalem. And then the covenant we're going to look at in verses 19 to 22, and then to perpetuity in verses 23 to 26. So it's just three sections we're gonna attack here. Now, in relation to Jerusalem, 14 to 18, it shows here that Jehovah will fulfill the promises he made in the Davidic covenant regarding Jerusalem. Behold, the days come, says Jehovah, that I will perform that good word which I have spoken concerning the house of Israel and concerning the house of Judah. In verse 14, God makes a commitment to fulfill the promise of the Davidic covenant. And he begins with the phrase, behold, the days are coming, says Jehovah. Remember, when we see behold, the days are coming, this is placing it into the prophetic future. And this is the 10th time this phrase has been used by Jeremiah. God will perform the good word, meaning the promises he has already made to both houses of Israel. God will fulfill to the fullest sense all the unfulfilled aspects of the Davidic covenant. We see in verses 15 to 16, we see Messiah's reign. In those days, and at that time, will I cause a branch of righteousness to grow up unto David. He shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In those days shall Judah be saved, and Jerusalem shall dwell safely. And this is the name whereby she shall be called, Jehovah our righteousness. So the means by which the Davidic covenant will be fulfilled is the Messiah's reign. In verse 15, the emphasis here is upon the messianic person. He starts out by giving us the timing of it. It's in those days and at that time. This means that in those days and at that time of, behold, the days come, of verse 14, prophetic future. And this is in the millennial kingdom. In the millennial or messianic kingdom, God will cause a branch of righteousness to grow up unto David, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In verse 16, the results of the Messiah's reign are in those days. Again, this means in the days in which the Messiah will rule, which will be the messianic or millennial kingdom. And at that time, when Judah be saved, and Jerusalem shall dwell safely. Jerusalem will then be called Jehovah our righteousness. Now, these verses sound very similar to back in Jeremiah 23, verses 5 to 6. However, there are a number of differences that we should not miss. We're going to look at them next. Now, although they use similar language and talk about a similar period, it's not exactly the same. In fact, the same period of time refers to the millennial kingdom, but there are 8 differences between the two passages of Jeremiah 23, 5 to 6, and Jeremiah 33, 15 and 16. And we're going to look at them right now. Now, the first difference is that in Jeremiah 23 says, behold, the days come. While Jeremiah 33 says, in those days and at that time. The second difference is that in Jeremiah 23, we are told, I will raise unto David. And in Jeremiah 33, it reads, I will cause to grow up unto David. Third difference is in Jeremiah 23, it says a righteous branch. Jeremiah 33, it says a branch of righteousness. Fourth difference is that in Jeremiah 23, it says, and he shall reign as king. Jeremiah 33 is silent, doesn't say anything. The fifth difference is that in Jeremiah 23, it dealt with Judah and Israel. However, in Jeremiah 33, it deals with Judah and Jerusalem. The sixth difference, Jeremiah 23 says, he shall be called, and that's the masculine pronoun is used, whereas in Jeremiah 33, it says, she shall be called, where the feminine pronoun is used. The seventh difference, in 23, the Hebrew perfect tense was used. In Hebrew, this emphasizes a completed action. That's in verse 20, in chapter 23. However, in Jeremiah 33, the imperfect tense is used, which emphasizes an incomplete action. Eighth difference is that in Jeremiah 23, the emphasis of the closing phrase was upon the Messiah, where he shall be called. However, we just saw here that it's Jerusalem who shall be called righteousness. She shall be called. Now, in dealing with the two differences in the eighth distinction, which is the he shall be called and she shall be called, in Jeremiah 23, it's the Messiah, because it is the Messiah. The Hebrew former tense is perfect, which means it's a completed action, and this emphasizes completion. The Messiah is righteous. It says a righteous branch, which emphasizes the absolute righteousness of the Messiah. Jeremiah 33 says, she shall be called, which refers to Jerusalem. And this is the imperfect tense being used to emphasize that the fact that the action at this point in time is still incomplete. So there's continuous growth. Instead of saying a righteous branch, it says a branch of righteousness. The righteousness is not absolute as it is with Messiah, but it is imputed to Jerusalem. So these are the minor differences between Jeremiah 23 and 33, and they all deal with the same basic truth anyway, which is the reign of Messiah in the millennial kingdom. But, if I didn't tell you, you probably thought they were exactly the same thing. Well, anyway, we know now. Slightly different emphasis in the two chapters. Okay, moving on. In verses 17 to 18, we have the promise of perpetuity. For thus says Jehovah, David shall never want a man to sit upon the throne of the house of Israel. Neither shall the priests, the Levites, want a man before me to offer burnt offerings and to burn meal offerings and to do sacrifice continually. So in verse 17, first of all, house of David will be perpetual. It'll just continue on eternally. David shall never want a man to sit upon the throne of the house of Israel. In keeping with the Davidic covenant, God promised that David will always have descendants or a seed to sit upon the Davidic throne, which is in Jerusalem, the house of David. What he's saying is the house of David will last forever. Now, why is this guaranteed? Well, this is guaranteed because the seed of David eventually culminates in an individual who is himself eternal. And this was seen back in Jeremiah 23, 5-6. This individual is the Messiah, the eternal God-man. And because he's eternal, because he has been resurrected from the dead, because he will not die again, he will have no successors. But his eternality guarantees the perpetuity of the house of David. Then we see in verse 18, there's the perpetuity of the house of Levi. Neither shall the priests of the Levites want a man before me to offer burnt offerings and to offer meal offerings and to do sacrifice continually. What he's saying here is that the priesthood would never lack a successor to offer sacrifices before Jehovah. The tribe of Levi will have a role in the millennial temple, and that role is described in great depth in Ezekiel chapters 40 to 48. Ezekiel 40 to 48. Now, the first area in which God reconfirms the Davidic covenant and the Levitical priesthood is in relationship to Jerusalem. That's the first area. The second area of reconfirmation is the concept of the covenant itself. We're going to find this in verses 19 to 22. Verses 19 to 22 show that the reconfirmation of the Davidic covenant and Levitical priesthood will now come in relation to the so-called covenant of uniformity. The covenant of uniformity. Well, what is that? Well, this covenant was established at the beginning of time, back in Genesis 1, verse 5, Genesis 1:5, and Genesis 8, verse 22. Genesis 8:22. And this guarantees the regular succession of of day and night. That's what the covenant of uniformity is. It guarantees the regular succession of day and night. And the word, this is verse 19, and the word of Jehovah came on to Jeremiah, saying, Thus says Jehovah, if you can break my covenant of the day and my covenant of the night, so that there shall not be day and night in their season. So in verse 19, the word of Jehovah came, and in verses 20 to 21, God spells out the impossibility of the breaking of the covenant of uniformity. In verse 20 is the impossibility. It would be impossible to break the covenant of the day and the night, resulting in the cessation of the interchange of day and night, if any man could break it. It's an impossibility. And that's why the covenant, Davidic covenant, Levitical priesthood will remain. Now, only if only if only they could break it. Verse 21, by way of application, can God's covenant with David also be broken. Only then could the Davidic covenant be broken, so that he would not have a son to reign upon his throne. And so the certainty of Messiah sitting on the throne and reigning is guaranteed because of day and night, because of the covenant of uniformity which began back in Genesis. Verse 21 says, Then may also my covenant be broken with David my servant, that he shall not have a son to reign upon his throne, and with the Levites, the priests, my ministers. So concerning Levi, only then could God's promises to Levi be rendered null and void. So only if the interchange of day and night could be caused to cease, only then could God's covenant with David be broken and his promise to the house of Levi be broken. But since it is impossible to do this, it is equally impossible to break God's covenant with David and God's promises to the house of Levi made in the days of Aaron the priest. Now, according to Numbers 25, verses 10 to 13, Jehovah made the following promise to Levi. Jehovah spoke unto Moses, this is Numbers 25, verses 10 to 13. Jehovah spoke unto Moses, saying, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned my wrath away from the children of Israel, in that he was jealous with my jealousy among them, so that I consume not the children of Israel in my jealousy. Wherefore say, Behold, I give unto him my covenant of peace, and it shall be unto him and to his seed after him, the covenant of an everlasting priesthood, because he was jealous for his God and made atonement for the children of Israel. So there we see the everlasting covenant made with the priesthood. That's the Levitical priesthood. So we're going to have Levites in the kingdom. We're going to be serving in the temple. Now, also in verse 22, not only will there not be a cessation, but there will be a multiplication of both the house of David and the house of Levi. As the host of heaven cannot be numbered, neither the sand of the sea measured, so will I multiply the seed of David my servant, and the Levites that minister unto him, or unto me, sorry. So the second area in which the reconfirmation came was in the area of the relationship with the covenant. Since God's covenants cannot be broken, which is laid down unconditionally, and since God is a covenant keeper and will not break these covenants, by the same token, these two houses are guaranteed survival, perpetuity, and a numerical increase. And the third area in which he reconfirms the covenants is in relationship to perpetuity itself. And this we find in verses 23 to 26. In verse 23, and the word of Jehovah came to Jeremiah, saying, so the word comes again to Jeremiah from Jehovah. And in verse 24, he describes the house of David and the tribe of Levi. Consider you not what this people have spoken, saying, the two families which Jehovah did choose, he has cast them off. Thus do they despise my people, that they should be no more a nation before them. So people were saying, well, especially the Gentile nations were saying that God is finished with the house of David and with the house of Levi. He has cast them off. They were saying that the promises God has made to David and to Levi have now been rendered null and void. In verses 25 to 26, we see the impossibility of breaking the covenant of uniformity. And he repeats what he said in the earlier segment. In verse 25, the emphasis here is upon the impossibility of this happening. Thus says Jehovah, if my covenant of day and night stand not, if I have not appointed the ordinances of heaven and earth, and of course, he did all these things. He appointed all these things. Just by the way, in my translation, we have the word if, my covenant. This is a conjunction. If is to be understood positively in this verse and could be regarded as surely as my covenant of day and night stand. As surely as I have appointed the ordinances of heaven and earth. So that's what it means, if, as surely as. Okay. So in verse 26, we have the application. Then will I also cast away the seed of Jacob and of David, my servant, that I will not take of his seed, meaning David's seed line, to be rulers over the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, well, that's the biblical definition of the Jews. A Jew is anyone who's a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So they are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's seed. God now intends to pick out rulers over the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob from the seed line of David. So again, only if a man can break the uniform laws which God has put into effect in his universe, only if that is possible, only if he can force the interchange between day and night to totally cease, then and only then can God's promises to these two houses be rendered null and void. That's the house of David and the house of Levi. However, this is not going to take place. God intends to take from the seed of David, specifically the Messiah, Jesus, in the kingdom. And he will rule over the Jewish people, the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, chapter 33 ends specifically with the promise of God, I will cause their captivity to return. Again, we see Jeremiah's favorite word, shuv, used here. And he goes on to say, God goes on to say, and I will have mercy on them. So, chapter 33, this brings us to the end of the book of consolation. We're now moving into the fourth major subdivision. Again, we're in the second section of Jeremiah, which is the largest section. It deals with the prophecies concerning Judah, which runs from chapter 2 to chapter 45. But in this large section, we have 5 subdivisions. Now, we've covered 3 of these smaller subdivisions, and we have 2 more to go. Fourth subdivision is the conflict with the kings. In the second subdivision, there was a conflict with the false prophets. in this section, we're going to have the conflict with the kings. Now, Jeremiah is going to be in conflict specifically with two kings in particular, two kings in particular, Zedekiah and Jehoiakim. And this is going to be chapter 34 to 39. Okay. Just when we first started off, I remember we went through when we first began, we said that the book of Jeremiah is not written in chronological order, but it is written by theme. And this section we're entering into now is a good example of that. Its overarching theme is Jeremiah's conflict with certain kings. The section begins and ends with Zedekiah, King Zedekiah, the last king of Judah. But it also mentions Jehoiakim and some other rulers. Now, a chronological order of chapter 34 to 39, which is the fourth section we're looking at here, is like this. We're going to see Jeremiah 34, 1 to 7, and then that's going to be we're not following it this way, but this is the way it is chronologically. Then it's going to be followed by Jeremiah 37, 1 to 10. So we're going to go from chapter 34, 1 to 7 to Jeremiah 37, 1 to 10. And then we go back to Jeremiah 34, verses 8 to 22. And then we go back to Jeremiah 37, 11 to 21. And then Jeremiah 38 and 39 follow on chronologically. Nearly only two. Okay. Now that you have a full grasp on that, let's head off. We're going to see the message to Zedekiah in verses 1 to 7, chapter 34. Now, in verse 1, we have the occasion for this message to Zedekiah. The word which came unto Jeremiah from Jehovah, when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army and all the kingdoms of the earth that were under his dominion, and all the peoples were fighting against Jerusalem and against all the cities thereof, saying. So, the Babylonians in this third war against the Jews included more than just men from Babylon, because we had soldiers from the many nations which had now been subjugated to Nebuchadnezzar, and they participated in this battle. That's why we have his army and all the kingdoms of the earth. Now, this message was given in the year 588 BC. It's 2 years prior to Jerusalem's destruction by the Babylonians. Remember, that was in 586 BC. And again, remember, it's not in chronological order, but it's in a theme order. The themes of 34 to 39 are based upon the theme of the conflict with the kings. Now, he begins with Zedekiah, then he goes back years earlier. So we're going to start off with Zedekiah in verses 1 to 7. Then he's going to go back to Jehoiakim, and then he returns to Zedekiah again. So it's a good, if we just put aside somewhere the chronological order of this section. Now, thus says Jehovah, the God of Israel, go and speak to Zedekiah, king of Judah, and tell him, thus says Jehovah, behold, I will give this city into the hand of the king of Babylon, and he shall burn it with fire. And thou shalt not escape out of his hand, but shall surely be taken and delivered into his hand. And your eyes shall behold the eyes of the king of Babylon, and he shall speak with you mouth to mouth, and you shall go to Babylon. Yet hear the word of Jehovah. This is verse 4. Yet hear the word of Jehovah, O Zedekiah, king of Judah. Thus says Jehovah concerning you, thou shalt not die by the sword. You shall die in peace, and with the burning of your fathers, the former kings that were before you, so shall they make a burning for you. And they shall lament you, saying, Ah, Lord, for I have spoken the word, says Jehovah. Now, verses 2 to 5 is the message itself. First of all, in verse 2, Jerusalem will be captured and burned. In verse 3, Zedekiah will be captured and taken into captivity. Now, this prophecy was fulfilled in 2 Kings 25, verses 6 to 7. Third, in verse 4, Zedekiah will not be executed. And then in verse 5, Zedekiah will die a natural death. Now, because of his rebellion against because of his rebellion, Zedekiah could have been executed by Nebuchadnezzar, but God promised that he would not die by the sword. He will die in peace. Now, this does not mean that he will die in wealth or in royalty, but he will die in peace, in contrast to dying by the sword. He'll die a peaceful death. When he dies, it will be with the burning of his fathers. Now, this fire does not refer to cremation, because Israel and Judah buried dead bodies rather than cremating them. This is a figure for an ancient Jewish funeral practice of burning fires and incense during the death of the king. Zedekiah will be honored in burial in the same manner in which former kings were honored in burial, and they shall make a burning for him. This is the fire and the incense. So spices would be burned for him, and he would be lamented. The burning has to do with aromatic spices in honor of the dead, and examples of this is in 2 Chronicles 16, verse 14, 2 Chronicles 16, 14, and 2 Chronicles 21, verse 19, 21, verse 19. They shall also lament and say, "Ah, Lord." Now, this is also mentioned in Jeremiah 22, 18. Back in Jeremiah 22, 18, we have the comment, the lament, "Alas, Lord," would stand in stark contrast to what happened at Jehoiakim's burial, mentioned in Jeremiah 22, 18. In Jeremiah 22, 18, with Jehoiakim's burial, "Therefore, thus says Jehovah concerning Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, they shall not lament for him, saying, 'Ah, my brother,' or 'Ah, sister.' They shall not lament for him, saying, 'Ah, Lord,' or 'Ah, his glory.'" So, Jehoiakim's funeral, the Jewish people refused to mourn for him. They would lament the death of his successor. However, they would lament the death of his successor, which is Zedekiah. When he dies, he'll be mourned by the people. Zedekiah will be mourned by the people. And to make certain that the promise is confirmed, God gives a confirmation, "For I have spoken the word, says the Lord." So what God has spoken will come to pass. In fact, the pronoun I have spoken, is in the emphatic state. And this is virtually saying, even I have spoken, what I'm saying is going to happen. Now, back in 2 Kings, we see Zedekiah taken into captivity. 2 Kings 25, 6-7. "Then they took the king, Zedekiah, and carried him up unto the king of Babylon to Riblah, and they gave judgment upon him. And they slew the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, and put out the eyes of Zedekiah, and bound him in fetters, and carried him to Babylon." So he wasn't killed by the sword, he was carried away to Babylon, although his eyes were plucked out after he saw his two sons, or after he saw his sons being killed. Now, in verses 6-7, we're now told how the message was delivered. "Then Jeremiah the prophet spake all these words unto Zedekiah, king of Judah, in Jerusalem, when the king of Babylon's army was fighting against Jerusalem, and against all the cities of Judah that were left, against Lachish and against Azekah, for these alone remained of the cities of Judah as fortified cities." So he's given this message while the siege is still going on. It's in verse 6, the word was spoken. It was also previously prophesied back in 32, 4-5, where almost the same words were used. Now, the fulfillment will be recorded in Jeremiah 39, 5-7, and again in 52, 8-11. So the fulfillment we'll see of this taking place, Jeremiah 39, verses 5-7, and again in Jeremiah 52, 8-11. Now, in verse 7 is the state of the nation at the time the message was delivered. At this time, Nebuchadnezzar was fighting against two of Judah's fortified cities. These were the only two cities of Judah left besides Jerusalem. So there's only the three of them left. The two cities were Lachish and Azekah, and these were the last of the fortified cities to fall. Now, archaeologists in digging at the city of Lachish, found a number of letters inscribed on clay potsherds written to the commander of the Lachish fortress. And these letters gave him instructions and asked questions concerning the state of the Babylonian siege. Lachish letter number 4, this is the number 4 letter, reads like this. Let my Lord know that we are watching for the signals of Lachish, according to all the indications which my Lord hath given, for we cannot see Azekah. In other words, when Jeremiah wrote verse 7, chapter 34, verse 7, both Lachish and Azekah were still standing, although they were under siege. By the time of this Lachish letter number 4, which was after Jeremiah 34:7, at that point, Azekah had fallen and only Lachish was still standing. And once Lachish fell, the road was now wide open for Jerusalem. We see the violation of a solemn covenant in verses 8 to 22. In verses 8 to 11, we see the covenant. Now, verse 8. The word that came unto Jeremiah from Jehovah after that the king Zedekiah had made a covenant with all the people that were at Jerusalem to proclaim liberty unto them, that every man should let his manservant and every man his maidservant, that is a Hebrew or a Hebrewess, go free, that none should make bondmen of them, to wit, of a Jew his brother. Okay. Now, this is not a divine covenant, okay? This is Zedekiah. It's a covenant made between, it is not a covenant made between God and man. It was a covenant, it was a human covenant made between men and men. In verses 8 to 9, we see the content of the covenant. It included the proclamation of liberty. A proclamation was now issued freeing the Jewish slaves, right? In verse 9, it meant the release of all Hebrew or Jewish slaves, including the men servants and the maid servants. And it proclaimed that no one should make a slave of another Jew. Jewish people had Jewish slaves, but these were not lifetime slaves. Rather, they were Jews who had fallen into a deep state of debt, and they had to serve for 6 years to pay off that debt to whoever they were indebted to. And then they would be released on the sabbatical year in the 7th year. Verse 10 says, and all the princes and all the people obeyed that had entered into the covenant, that everyone should let his manservant and everyone his maidservant go free, that none should make bondmen of them any more. They obeyed and let them go. But afterwards they turned and caused the servants and the handmaids whom they had let go free to return, and brought them into subjection for servants and for handmaids. So in verse 10, it was decreed that all the Jewish slaves should be set free. And this is what happened. Also, the ones who had entered into this covenant included all the princes and the people. They obeyed and all entered into this covenant. This is the covenant made by Zechariah with the people. And the verse reiterates here that this was a human covenant, one that the king of Jerusalem had set up with his officials and the general population. Now, under its terms, they agreed to let the Jewish slaves go, which they did. However, verse 11 shows that the freedom was short-lived. Nevertheless, suddenly in verse 11, they violated this covenant that they had made. And the people of Jerusalem went back on their word and violated the covenant, forcing their fellow Jews back into slavery. Now, after they returned, we see here, again, Jeremiah uses his word shuv, they caused the servants that they had released to become slaves again. And this is a direct violation of the law of Moses, which we see in verses 12 to 16. Verses 12 to 16 show that the breaking of the human covenant made with Zedekiah with the people violated the Mosaic covenant, because in verse 12, the word of Jehovah came in response to the violation of the covenant of verse 11. Verse 12 introduces the passage with the word of the Lord. Therefore, the word of Jehovah came to Jeremiah from Jehovah, saying, verses 13 to 14, God reminded the people of the original command regarding slavery. The timing of this original command is mentioned in verse 13. Thus says Jehovah, the God of Israel, I made a covenant with your fathers in the day that I brought them forth out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, saying. So this was during the Exodus period where Jehovah made a covenant with his people that included the commandments regarding Jewish bondage. And the command to free the Jewish slaves after 6 years of servitude is found in Exodus 21, verse 2 to 11, Exodus 21, 2 to 11, Leviticus 25, verses 39 to 46, Leviticus 25, 39 to 46, and Deuteronomy 15, verse 1, Deuteronomy 15, verse 1, and Deuteronomy 15, verses 12 to 18. At the end of the verse 14, at the end of the 7 years, you shall let go every man his brother that is a Hebrew that has been sold unto you and has served you 6 years. You shall let him go free from you, but your fathers hearkened not unto me, neither inclined their ear. So we're told in verse 14 that the content of the command was that after the 6 years, all Hebrew slaves should be freed. The law was that after 6 years, these slaves were to be freed after having already served their period of time to repay their debt. In fact, many of them had probably served longer than 6 years at this point in time where Jeremiah is. Zedekiah had issued this covenant to get them to release their slaves. But your fathers did not obey me nor incline their ear. So their fathers had not released their Jewish slaves after 6 years of service. And it seemed also the present generation was going to rectify the problem. We're going to let them free. Fantastic. However, just as previous generations had failed to obey God's command, so did Zedekiah's generation, despite the initial obedience. Because in verse 15, he points out the initial obedience of the present generation. And you were now turned. Here again, shuv. And had done that which is right in mine eyes, in proclaiming liberty, every man to his neighbor. So when the Jewish slaves were freed, God was pleased. Why? Because the people were now obeying the Mosaic law. And you had made a covenant before me in the house, which is called by my name. Verse 15b, the second part, reveals that King Zedekiah made this covenant with his people. Where did he make it? He made it before me in the house which is called by my name. Now, the house that is called by Jehovah's name is the temple. The place where this covenant was decreed by Zedekiah was inside the temple compound. The fact that it was decreed in the temple compound now added to its solemnity, and that made disobedience to it that much greater. However, their initial obedience was followed by disobedience, because in verse 16, but you turned and profaned my name. The means of profaning God's name here was that they made this human covenant in God's presence in the temple compound. Then they broke the covenant, and that profaned the very name of God. Second part of verse 16 details the sin of the people. Moreover, the profaning came by means of causing every man his servant and handmaid, which you had let go free at their pleasure, to return. And they didn't return by choice. The people had profaned God's name by forcing their fellow Jews to return into slavery. And you brought them into subjection once again for servants and for handmaids. Yeah, Jeremiah uses his word return here differently when he refers to turning to God, to turning away from obedience, and to returning to slavery. Now, what's the context of all of this? Well, what's the historical context? The historical context here is that in the 9th year of Zedekiah, he rebelled against Babylon, right? Remember, Babylonians came and besieged Jerusalem. but then the Babylonians were forced to lift the siege of Jerusalem to stop the threat from the Egyptians. Remember, Zedekiah had formed an alliance with Pharaoh Hophra to come to his aid if he was attacked. So they came to his aid. The Babylonians left the siege, confronted them. After defeating the Egyptians, the Babylonians returned and defeated Judah in the 11th year. Now, when the Babylonians first arrived and besieged the city in an attempt to please God during that time, this covenant was made and the Jewish slaves were freed and released. Now, with the siege taking place, not much work was possible because, you know, you're all in siege inside of the city walls. It was to some degree to the financial benefit to the slave owners to actually free their slaves. Otherwise, you know, they're going to have to continue feeding them while they were not producing any income for them. So during the first part of the siege, it was during the first part of the siege that the slaves were freed. However, when the Babylonians lifted the siege to meet the Egyptian threat, the Jewish slave owners felt the danger was past, and they then forced the Jews back into slavery after the siege was lifted. And this showed that their original motivation for freeing the slaves was not to find God's pleasure, but because of their own self-interest. Didn't have to feed them, didn't have to do anything for them. However, when the danger now passed and the slaves could earn income for them again, they were enslaved once again. And all of this was in clear violation of the Mosaic law. And these Jewish slaves had already served their time of 6 years under the Mosaic law, and they should have been released long before this time. Finally, they were released only to be brought back into subjection again. And this brings on the judgment in verses 17 to 22. Therefore, thus says Jehovah, you have not hearkened unto me to proclaim liberty, every man to his brother, every man to his neighbor. Behold, I proclaim unto you a liberty, says Jehovah, to the sword, the pestilence, to the famine. And I will make you to be tossed to and fro among all the kingdoms of the earth. So, once again, they proved themselves to be in active disobedience to Jehovah. Once again, a clear statement of God's judgment is now made. In verse 17, as they proclaimed liberty to the captives earlier, now God will also issue a proclamation of liberty for them. Since Israel failed to honor their proclamation of liberty that was given to every man to his brother and every man to his neighbor, God now proclaims liberty to the triad of the sword, the famine, the pestilence, to destroy at will. The result will be that they'll be then tossed to and fro among all the kingdoms of the earth. They would become a horrifying sight for the entire world. Verses 18 to 20, he further spells out death to the covenant breakers. And I'll give the men that have transgressed my covenant, that have not performed the words of the covenant which they made before me, when they cut the calf in twain, passed between the parts thereof. The princes of Judah and the princes of Jerusalem, the eunuchs and the priests, and all the people of the land that passed between the parts of the calf. Verses 18 to 19, the covenant was made by passing between the parts of a calf. And this is a blood covenant. And they failed to keep the covenant made before God in the temple compound. And this covenant was made by passing between the halves of the calf. The violators of verse 19 included the princes of Judah, the princes of Jerusalem, eunuchs who were usually high government officials, also involved with the priests and the general population. No one had an excuse. And in verse 20, their judgment is now spelled out. I will even give them into the hand of their enemies, and into the hand of them that seek their life. And their dead bodies shall be for food unto the birds of the heavens and to the beasts of the earth. In verse 21, and Zedekiah, king of Judah, and his princes will I give into the hand of their enemies, into the hand of them that seek their life, into the hand of the king of Babylon's army that are gone away from you. In verse 21, Zedekiah and the leaders will be turned over to the Babylonians who had temporarily lifted the siege. The slaves were released while Jerusalem was besieged. When the siege was lifted, the people felt the danger was past, temporarily lost their fear. They caused the slaves to return to slavery. In verse 22, behold, I will command, says Jehovah, and cause them to return to this city, and they shall fight against it. This is Babylon. And take it and burn it with fire, and I will make the cities of Judah a desolation without inhabitant. In verse 22, God says the Babylonians will return. They'll return because God will command them to return and cause them to return to this city. And after the defeat of the Egyptians, they did return to the city. The Babylonians will fight against the city and burn it with fire. And the result will be that I will make the cities of Judah a desolation without inhabitant. Now notice, it's not merely Jerusalem, but I will make the cities of Judah a desolation without inhabitant. And that is where we shall leave it for this session. Thanks for coming along. Study hard, grow strong.